Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to our little stream about the anatomy of an API. Let's see. Let's give a second to everybody to join, and then we'll kind of get started. I can see. Is everybody now on? Nice. So again, welcome. My name is Vedran. I'm the CEO and founder of Trouble. And today with me, I've got two really great folks to talk about APIs. So ladies first, of course, I've got Deepa Goyal from Postman. She leads product strategy, and I'll let her kind of introduce herself to all of you right now, and then we'll go to Andy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in today's live stream. I'm very excited to discuss the anatomy of an API report. So I am currently a product strategy lead at Postman. I'm also the author of API analytics for product managers. So this is a topic of particular interest for me, and I'm very excited to dive in. I'll let Andy go next.
Hey, everybody. I'm Andy. I'm the product manager here at Trouble. Interestingly enough, I worked with Deepa at Postman, so I have a background in the API space. But yeah, working with Vedran to move Trouble forward.
Yeah, so essentially we're all friends here, and we're just gonna discuss a bunch of different things that we were able to kind of discover and understand from the report that we did, and a couple of things that kind of Deepa understands from their Postman report, and see how that kind of fits together and mixes nicely. So in case you didn't know, like I think 2 weeks ago, we released this report called The Anatomy of an API, where we analyzed over 1 billion API requests across 9,000 different APIs. And we wanted to kind of understand, how does an average API look like? What technology is it using? How many endpoints does it have? A bunch of different things, so we can kind of understand how users are building APIs today, what we should improve, and how to get people to build even better APIs. So I've got the report in front of me. The idea is, together with Andy and Deepa, we're just going to go through a couple of really interesting stats, and we're going to discuss about each and every one of them, and kind of provide a bit of a more deeper understanding on what we think is happening, and essentially why stats like this matter. So a brief intro, how can we even analyze 1 billion API requests? Well, we kind of have this observability platform called Trouble, and what we do there is provide an API observability platform that does a lot of different things. So it's an end-to-end platform for everything that you do on your API. And we've got over 9,000 different APIs that are running Trouble in production. And we analyze over 500,000 API requests per month. Of course, all the data was randomized, so no security, no sensitive stuff or actual data was kind of scraped along here. We just wanted to understand how people are building these APIs. So let's start off with the 5 key findings, and then we can kind of go move into some of the other areas. So in short, for everybody who doesn't have a lot of time to kind of spend maybe an hour with us, I'll kind of drill down some of the most important things that we were able to find. The number one is not surprising at all. AI APIs doubled in 2023. So literally, the number of AI-related APIs that we saw on our platform grew by 96% compared to 2022. This essentially includes APIs that have an AI domain, or have AI in their name, description, or something else. That's the best way we could determine some of these things. I'm sure there's even more, but the growth here is quite staggering. The second thing that's really important to kind of or surprising, and I know Andy has a lot of opinions about this, and we'll get to that, is most APIs requests are actually made midweek. So essentially, there's a close tie between Wednesday and Thursday when it comes to sheer volume of API requests that are happening every single week. And again, this is consistent across all 9 months, year long. We saw that basically Wednesday is the most popular day, followed by Thursday by a close margin. Then the next kind of key finding is that every fifth endpoint on an API is a zombie endpoint. Now, this is a fascinating one. I can't say personally I wasn't surprised, but generally 20% of all endpoints on an average API don't get a request for more than 30 days, making them essentially dead weight on the API, or making them an endpoint that isn't used by anybody. Next one, APIs are still very insecure. So unfortunately, 51% of all requests didn't have any form of authentication, which is really kind of bad. And 55% of them had a medium threat level score. And again, we'll get into that literally in a second. When we talk about the last kind of the fifth key finding, we kind of talk about problems, and surprisingly enough, most of the problems that happen on the API actually happen on the client side. This means that the clients are producing more errors than the server side, or actually more 400 type errors than 500 type errors. So these are like kind of the boiled down, the stripped down version of the report, and the 5 most interesting key findings. So now we can actually dive deeper into specifically a couple of different categories. So this report goes through 3 of them. The first one, of course, is API design, and we're
Can
now
we spend a
kinda,
little bit more time on the 5
yeah,
before
yeah,
we go deeper?
yeah,
Let's just at a high level take a look at them.
yeah.
Uh,
I'll kind
and
of zoom
maybe we
out. Can
can
you guys see all 5 on one screen? There you go.
see. Yeah,
There,
now we can
yeah,
see
yeah.
it. Yeah, I think it would really help our audience to kind of get some high level uh, insight into why these 5 things matter and how they will trickle down as we go deeper. So I think the first one is very interesting. There's definitely uh, this boom in the AI space that we have seen, and I've talked about it a few different platforms recently. Is how the way AI experiences are delivered is through APIs. So they're really very closely tied together. So it's interesting to see that pattern really continue in terms of like it has actually doubled. People are very interested in producing and consuming AI related APIs. We are also seeing on Postman platform, we're seeing this increase in people searching for AI related APIs, and of course everybody's aware how much interest there is in that space. But something I found really interesting here, I think 2 of my favorite findings here has been number 2 and 3. So prior to Postman, I've been at Twilio and PayPal, and both of them, of course, operate across industries. Their customers are across industries, and it's interesting to see that in when we look at API usage, somehow weekly grain makes a lot of sense because kind of there is always this weekly pattern that I've seen across industries. And because ultimately when we boil it down, the users uh, across most industries like retail
Yeah.
or healthcare have specific days in the week where their customers are more active or uh, more available. Like, there are certain days in the week where people feel more comfortable scheduling a doctor's appointment. There are certain days in the week where people tend to shop a lot. So there's definitely patterns in most industries especially when we step up from the layer of web experiences and go into actual API experiences. I've seen this pattern of weekly usage being very relevant, and it would be interesting for me to hear from you guys. You're more closer to the data, if this pattern of like Wednesday actually varies across industries, because I know that later in the report you dive down, you dive down by industries, you do have that dimension in your data. So it would be interesting to see if that pattern is consistent across all of them or if it changes.
I think this is Andy. One of the first things that Andy, like when we were putting the report, he's like, "This is really fascinating to me." So Andy, I'll let you kind of take the lead on this one and kind of explain why it was actually fascinating for you as well, especially given that both of you are kind of really product focused and you liked this metric.
Yeah. So to answer your question, Deepa, no, we unfortunately didn't. I think go as granular as looking at this statistic by industry. But I found it interesting because a lot of what I had read previously, I think there's a Forbes article, I think there's a survey by UConn, there's a few different places that sort of ask the question, what's the most productive day of the week for like business? And it's always Monday or Tuesday, and Tuesday's usually the day that kind of wins out on these surveys, right? And I was like, well, if that's the most productive day, that would, in my thinking, right, like that would be the day that you would probably have the most API requests. But then that wasn't the case when we looked at the data. So I was like, okay, are people, it does like, we think about going to your like example of e-commerce, right? Like, are people shopping more on Wednesdays than the product the requests that they're doing that make them productive on a Tuesday, right? Like, so anyways, that was just some of like the thoughts that I had. It was interesting. It wasn't like a huge difference, right, between from like Monday to say Friday, right? There wasn't a huge jump in days, but you know, certainly there was like this like curve, right, where Wednesdays sort of won out, and then it kind of, you know, requests started dropping off toward the end of the week. But
I would urge you to, like, when you get a chance, to dive into it from the industry dimension. Also, like, I think the way I have validated this in the past has been looking at holiday weeks.
Okay.
So if you compare an average week with the holiday week, it really tells you the trend of the impact of day of week on the actual usage pattern. So maybe next time when we chat, we can
to like further make the connections here, right? If we look at the zombie endpoints, like, are the zombie endpoints greater or less by industry, and are they greater or less based on like some, you know, holiday weeks versus, you know, any other time of year, right?
Yeah, there could be zombie endpoints that are only utilized at a certain point. You know,
so we didn't do an industry one, but we did do a quarterly breakdown and compare the data from like 2022 to 2023. So not only Wednesday and Thursday are the most popular kind of generally in the week, but also from what's kind of shown here in 2023, Q3 has been definitely by far the most popular quarter, and then followed by Q2, Q1, almost nothing, in Q4, almost nothing. Again, I feel like you guys have kind of somewhat touched upon this, but I think it has a lot to do with industries. Like, we've seen heavy usage from IT industry, higher education, financial services, and I'm assuming that a lot of these guys actually take a lot of time to kind of wrap up and heat up in their business week. So, for example, if a lot of the industries come from IT, they don't tend to push anything out or kind of produce any meaningful stuff on a Friday, especially on a Monday. Then when it comes to marketing, if you think about it, most of the content even that we post usually actually happens either on a Wednesday or Thursday. Like, if you go around the office and ask them what's the most popular time to post on social media, the answer is going to be, you know, Wednesday or Thursday, especially something like LinkedIn or something similar. So I think
I'm pretty sure if we were to slice this by industry, we would see that retail, for example, would probably be very, very active in Q4. And it's always like going up towards the end of the year. Versus, like, if we compare education, Anybody in education is probably not
break, right?
that active on spring break, and during the times where schools are off. Like, so I think that usually is a great way to validate some of these findings when we look at it and see how it actually varies between the industries. This is interesting. I would have guessed that the usage would be higher in Q4 no matter what, honestly. So it's interesting to see that it's actually higher in Q3.
Well,
I mean,
this isn't all of Q4, right? For this year, this was just the snapshot that we had of Q4.
Oh yes,
So basically, this is data up until, I would say, almost like 1st of December. So we're assuming, and it was already 14%, so it's got a month left, which is where you're right. Probably the most amount of shopping, the most amount of API calls is going to go out in the next 5 days, probably.
Yeah, and is this data mostly US based?
So it's actually a mix. We didn't track. We do have we'll go into the locations, but it's heavily US based. There's a mix, of course. We have users all over the world, but primarily, I would say the focus or the source of the data is primarily US based APIs. This is also I know why you're asking, because, for example, I would say that Q3 in Europe is basically probably lower, the lowest quarter ever, because most of Europe is on holiday from like 15th of July to like 15th of September, whereas you guys in the US don't necessarily go to vacation.
It's a busy quarter. Like Q3,
you guys don't take three month long vacations.
Unfortunately.
For now, but maybe you will soon. But going back to the last two that we didn't kind of comment before we dive into some of the other stuff, what do you think, Andy, about every fifth endpoint being essentially a zombie endpoint? And Deepa, you can kind of dive deeper into that as well once Andy gives us his answer.
I sort of struggled with this, and I don't really have like a good explanation. I just like thinking about like the design thinking of APIs, and like when you're thinking through what endpoints they're going to be, like, I don't know if like the fifth endpoint is when you sort of like hit a wall, or you start transitioning to like the next group of endpoints in your like thinking. And that's why like it's just like sort of like a not a like a zombie endpoint, right? Like not used. I don't know. Deepa, what do you think? Oh, you're on mute.
Zombie APIs do come up even in the state of the API report at Postman. I think it's interesting that we found that it's one in every 5 endpoint. But I think what is more important is to realize that this is actually already a very top of mind concern for most organizations, because zombie endpoints are one of the biggest security threats. So I think it doesn't I think the more important thing is just how prevalent they are. And even if we think about like it's 1 in 5, one of the things I would be interested in understanding is like, how do you define zombie endpoint? I think you're saying not being used in 30 days.
Exactly.
Right. So zombie endpoints are widely talked about as a security threat, and I think 5% is as bad as 20% in my mind.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So
I also wonder too, right? Like from an observability standpoint, right? Are we, and this is like a product management question, right? When we're looking at like our metrics, are we looking at them from an API level, or are we getting granular enough to say like, I want to know what that endpoint is doing? I want to know, like, you know what I mean? So if the overall the API itself has a lot of requests, you're seeing a lot of traffic, but like you're not diving in granularly to look at each endpoint, then you're just like not really, you're going to miss it, right? Potentially.
I look at this, I've developed a lot of APIs in my day. And usually this comes down to like sometimes a lot, or at least in my opinion, a lot of the times it actually comes down to feature creep. Like, just think about it. Like, we're building insights, right? And we're thinking, okay, let's add like, let's have an endpoint that handles, tests, and let's allow them to do this, and this. Then somebody comes in and says, hey, but we need to assume that somebody's going to want to do this. And that actually happens less than you expect. And then you end up with these endpoints that aren't actually kind of used a lot, because that feature, from a product perspective, either didn't live up to the expectation, or isn't, let's say, marketed as well as,
or it's covering an edge case that is
exactly,
rare,
exactly. But like Deepa said, that then starts becoming a security issue where, because nobody's asking about it, nobody's maintaining that endpoint, nobody's looking at that code, it's just sitting there. We've seen some horrendous stuff happen, like leaks, data leaks based off of these endpoints, people abusing it, etc., etc. So it's not really kind of not really a good kind of metric to have. That actually ties into the next one, which, again, as somebody who develops APIs, uses APIs every single day, this doesn't really surprise me. I have a theory around this, and 50% of all APIs kind of don't have any form of authentication. I've seen this happen countless times. Developers generally, or engineers, when they're developing these internal APIs or APIs that are not necessarily public facing, they're just like, oh, nobody knows the URL. Why should I add authentication to it? Or I don't want to add, an overly complicated database schema for it. I don't want to expire tokens, so I'll just not do anything. What do you guys think? Why is this such a high number? When, in my opinion, adding authentication is probably one of the simplest things from like a engineering perspective you can do on an API.
Deepa, you want to go first?
Sure. I think authentication by itself doesn't solve all security problems. I think that's step one. I think as we think about API security, and I'm not an expert by any means, but I think there's a lot of different aspects that go into making an API secure. And in fact, I've always wondered, like, who can confidently say that our APIs are 100% secure? Like, is there anyone, and like, how do they decide that? So I think this one is a little hard for me in terms of wrapping my head around how objective this metric is, in terms of truly describing the state of APIs.
Yeah. So I have two thoughts, right? One, if the majority of requests are simply GET requests, do you necessarily need to have auth for a GET request? I think that's a question.
You always need to have auth.
The other
That's
thing,
the baseline.
Baseline, always have auth. Two is, I think there's sort of like a speed to cost to risk ratio, that's, or like analysis that might take place, right? And it's like, well, if we add auth to everything, including all of our GET requests that are giving just, no meaningful data, let's say, right? Like, do we need to spend the extra effort, the extra time to add auth, right? So,
to me, to wrap it up, I've been using this analogy whenever I talk to somebody who's like, oh, but we might not need auth. Generally, like, if you think about an API as your house or your apartment, you probably have a key to that house or an apartment. And that means that not everybody from the street can randomly walk into your house, open the fridge, drink some milk or something else, and be like, hey, Andy, or hey, Deepa, I'm in the apartment, thanks for letting me drink some milk. It just doesn't happen if you have that key. And just think of an API like that. You probably want to have control, even if you are making like simplified GET requests. what if you end up stuck in some kind of a loop where it's making GET requests every second? You probably want to have the luxury of being able to kick out that person without kind of sacrificing the entire API. So that's why, to me, it's one of those things that I'll never probably understand why people are not kind of doing this regularly. But we'll see how that evolves essentially next year. The last one on our kind of short list is most problems with APIs happen on the client side. As I've mentioned, like to me, this was a bit surprising because theoretically I expected a lot more errors to come from the actual server, meaning errors in the 500 PM range. But essentially, it actually makes sense that that it's actually client side, because if we'll dive deeper into that later, but a lot of these 4xx errors are actually either unauthenticated ones or not found, so resource not found, right? Did you guys expect something like this, or?
I think this supports why IT people and developers can be jerks, especially coming from the customer success side. And you're like, oh, my customer is having this issue and I know it's not them. And the support person or engineer that I'm talking to is like, no, it's totally them. Like, don't bother me with this, right? And it is.
Deepa, what about you? What do you think?
I think the flip side of this, and we go into it when we get to that section of the report, is that about 94% were success
Yeah.
requests. And I think, when we think about SLAs, for example, and we try to like go at like 99% SLA,
Yeah.
and then we look at the numbers, it's like 90, 92 or no, sorry, 94% and 99 are pretty far apart. So I think in terms of course, when we look at errors, I can imagine that on the server side, once you have a stable, scalable production API, you may not see as many outages.
Yeah.
And most of the errors are going to be on the client side. And I kind of expected that. So it's good to see that validated. But at the same time, I feel like it's also equally important to see that the flip side of how much success we have still needs a lot of work.
Yeah.
I
And I think this like raises the like very important point of like having good response messages, like having like directions for your customers when they screw up, and maybe don't like beat them or just like say, oh, sorry, like you have a problem. Like that's it. That's all you
Yeah.
see is like there's a problem, right?
I agree. Andy's spot on there. I think most of the time when we see a four, even when I kind of make a four, when I make a request and I get a 400, I'm like, that can't be right, and I immediately trigger it once again just to be 100% sure that maybe something else is wrong. So if we kind of move to the first section of our report, which is essentially we divided the report into three sections, right? So one of them is of course API design, API performance, and API security, and the last one being API market. So we're gonna kind of talk about API design first, and what that entails is essentially how people are generally structuring their APIs, what kind of technology they're using, how many endpoints they have, etc., etc. Anything that can point us into the direction of how people are designing these APIs, you can find here. So one of the first things is, we wanted to understand how many endpoints does an average API have, and the answer is actually 22. The biggest one we've seen had 319 endpoints on one single API. Now, from my experience, I can tell you that's not the biggest that I've heard in the world. I've heard even more. But 319 endpoints is a pretty beefy API, if you ask me. And then we wanted to kind of break down the number of endpoints in groups. So still predominantly, most people, 48% of them, have 1 to 10 endpoints. 37.5% have 11 to 50. 51 to 100 have 11.5%, and above 100 is roughly 3% of people or APIs that have more than 100 endpoints. Now, Deepa and I briefly touched upon this and discussed how they found something similar in Postman, and I think we wrote it down. To me, and I would love to get opinions on this, this indicates that we're still predominantly in this microservice driven and oriented architecture where essentially people are kind of building these smaller APIs that are serving a single purpose or something like that. And that's why we see a smaller number of endpoints.
So
I
this
think
is very
that.
much validated by the state of the API report at
Okay.
Postman. So we did find that microservices have the dominant share of like 42%, from 40,000 of participants that participated on our survey this year. And interesting terminology that we saw emerge was that 20% actually said that they have meso services or right-sized APIs,
Okay.
what they consider right size, and about 10% were the macro services, the large, and their main concern was that once they become large, I guess it's very large and unwieldy, difficult to maintain, difficult uh, uh, to update and manage. And I think that as APIs tend to get larger and larger, have more and more endpoints, that's where you start to see the maintainability, the cost go up, the
Yeah.
the risk go up in terms of security, because you're inevitably going to end up with zombie endpoints if you have too many endpoints. So I
Absolutely.
think, I'm sure that there's a good correlation between how many endpoints you have and how many of them are zombie endpoints.
Absolutely.
And I think the consumer side is important here too, right? Making sure that the APIs can be easily consumed, easily understood. You know exactly what that's doing, right?
I agree.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the like, we used to have a kind of a monolith approach as well, and we're moving that to a microservice API first kind of architecture as well internally, uh, and it allows you to do many different things that you can't otherwise do. For example, you can have any, build one API and can be consumed by any platform. Meaning, let's say we wanted to build a website or a mobile app or I don't know, a VS Code extension or something like that. You get the benefits of building these smaller APIs that are used for one purpose. And Andy, I think one of the things here is the identity kind of API that we're developing for Treble at the moment. Like,
Yep.
we're building this auth API that basically will have somewhere between 1 to 10 endpoints. One developer is going to take care of that. It's going to be very simple to dive in and understand that. Whereas if we were building something like Deepa suggested, like a bigger API, it gets really, really complicated from a programming perspective to get somebody onboarded on that API, both internally and externally as well. So I'm glad the Postman kind of report back has our back on this one, or as well. The next thing that I personally always kind of wanted to look at is how many, I feel like HTTP methods are heavily underused. So are the response codes, but we'll get to that a bit later. I've seen a lot of horrible APIs that are basically only get based, or use get for a lot of things that they shouldn't. But generally, we wanted to understand the usage across get, post, put, patch, delete options, and of course head. And we've seen that 68% of all requests, right, billion requests, are actually get requests. 21% post, put is 4%, and everything else is almost 3% and less. So patch 3%, delete 3%, and options 2%. Now, my comment on this, immediately when I saw this, is, first of all, people are underutilizing all the other HTTP methods, but most importantly, I think most of the APIs are built to be consumed and not built to create new kind of content or create anything in that sense. Do you guys agree?
Absolutely, especially considering, like, one of the things I want to highlight for our audience is that this particular data is looking at production APIs.
Yeah.
So these are APIs that are being consumed by a large number of users. So I think there's an inherent bias in looking at this data, because we are inevitably going to end up with APIs that are built to be consumed. Um, so I don't have uh, the data in front of me, but I'm sure that if we looked at Postman, for example, if we had that data and we looked at how many what all methods are being used by developers, because at Postman we have the other uh, perspective where it's actually in the development phase and in design
Yeah.
phase where developers are using Postman, it might look slightly different. There's also the interesting aspect of, at Postman we also have a lot of internal APIs being built on Postman platform, which could potentially be using more variety of HTTP methods. So it's possible when we look at production APIs, I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is mostly commercial APIs built for consumption at scale. So when we look at that inherent bias in the data, then I think this only validates that that bias is like, yes, this, we're looking specifically at commercial APIs, so it makes sense. It would be it would be it would be alarming if people were using a lot of delete.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I mean, you're right. A lot of the folks generally tend to use treble in production. We do have teams that absolutely start with kind of testing and development because they get automatically generated documentation. But predominantly, the most amount of volume, like you said, happens in production. And to a degree, I can agree with you. But I always thought that, APIs are generally meant to exchange data, and I always I mean, the kind of general purpose of APIs is let's exchange data, right? And it seems like a lot of the time the exchange is only one-sided, right? So you're just kind of getting some data back, consuming data, and you're not sending data, any data back. But definitely kind of makes sense, your logic there. Andy, do you want to add something to this?
No, I mean, I tend to agree. I don't really have a lot more to add to this one.
Nice. Before we kind of move we've talked about zombie endpoints. I don't want to kind of beat the bush, but Deepa was kind of again on point when she said that generally what we've observed, this sentence right here. So on bigger APIs, so from 1 to 10, we don't observe this trend of kind of zombie endpoints. But as soon as you start going above 10 endpoints, you start getting at least 1 to 2 zombie endpoints amongst all of those. So, if you have an API going forward in 2024 and you see there's more than 10, especially if there's 20, maybe consider kind of checking whether or not all of them are alive, because that's what we've been able to kind of figure out.
Yep.
Now,
I think we got one of the participants. We got a question on
that's what I
zombie
wanted
APIs.
that's what I wanted to ask immediately. Yes. Like, if somebody has a question, go for it. Let's just see how I can see that question.
So in the comments,
yeah.
Steve, actually, he's a product manager at Spotify.
Yeah.
He has asked, how are unused endpoints a security threat?
Of course.
So I would
do you want to take that, or do you want me, or both of us?
I would love for you to share some insights. Like I said, I'm not a security expert. I know that those are.
I feel like everybody's gonna say
Vedran, I think you actually answered this a little. Answered the question a little bit, like right after he said it, and I don't even think you knew it. But go ahead.
So in my view, and what we've seen happen, and I've looked at a lot of code and built a lot of code, and usually whenever I remember like what could be a zombie API on one of the APIs that I've built for other clients, it would usually be that edge case or something that they pushed after the fact, after we, let's say, agreed, hey, we're going to build this API, this is how it looks like. And they're like, oh, but we need this one thing to be added just in case it's there. And usually these are probably trickier scenarios. So a lot of the times when you're maintaining an API, when you're checking permission, when you're adding different checks for permissions, when you're developing limits, offsets, when you're making sure that people have enough permissions to access that resource, when you're not leaking data, you're most likely gonna check that on like the APIs that are being used, and then you're gonna left out the APIs that are simply you're like, hey, nobody uses this, I don't need to touch this. And then we see a lot of scenarios, especially with like GET requests from the database. So a lot of the times, like I've had the experience of these zombie endpoints being, let's say, some kind of reports that maybe get called every 60, 90 days. And these report-based, let's say, APIs, endpoints, usually have like a database query that goes through a lot of data, spits that out, returns something, and this is where you start becoming unsafe with that, because you might potentially be returning more data if you're not paying attention to that, if nobody's updating that, etc., etc. So I think it's first and foremost, when we say security, I think it's primarily a maintenance problem that then probably becomes a security threat. Hopefully that kind of makes a bit.
And I think you mentioned something very interesting there, is just like how the use case too could be something that is not in the realm of like primary security oversight. So if when we're building APIs for our primary product, there are certain standards and governance and everything, but a lot of times these internal APIs or limited use APIs that we end up building, we just from just humanly limitation, that sometimes it's easy for them to not go through the same level of rigor.
It's like a checklist thing in your mind.
And it's possible that we're designing them to be less secure just because we don't anticipate them to be used as much.
Exactly. I actually remember building one of these zombie endpoints, and it literally was about one client wanted one specific vendor to have access to some data that nobody else had. And we built a GET request that would just kind of return the data in the format that they wanted specifically. So not only was it something that they were accessing periodically from time to time, but it was also very specific. It was a completely different resource model than what we used everywhere else. So for example, I remember we updated the original resource model, removed a bunch of data because we kind of deemed it unsafe or something like that. And then, of course, we didn't update this resource model. So like Deepa mentioned, as you grow the API, this can quickly get out of control and actually become a security threat.
Yeah. And I would say too, just like thinking through it, right? Like, especially if your naming conventions aren't like really clear and you start naming things similarly, then you could all like, I don't know, that just like is an easy slippery slope to fall down.
I agree. Let's see if there's anything else. Kevin, why do zombie APIs exist? Where previously used APIs were previously used APIs deprecated but not removed? So a lot of questions that I can't actually answer because in most cases.
So just to clarify for Kevin, so we're talking about endpoints and not necessarily APIs, although like again, like API terminology is like mix and match, right? So I was thinking in my mind, right, you have an API with multiple endpoints, and the fifth endpoint within that API is the zombie endpoint. The API might get a ton of usage overall, right? But it's just that fifth endpoint nobody's paying attention to and nobody uses.
We could even tackle the question of zombie APIs as like a special category.
Yeah, for sure.
I given that we have a lot of
that's probably a bigger security risk, by the way.
Exactly. we talk to a lot of bigger companies that have, let's say, 1,000+ developers, and there you have very, very wild scenarios that maybe if you're in a smaller company, in a small team that's very serious about APIs, you would never even think of. But for example, off the top of my head, I can give you a couple of examples how zombie APIs start to become a reality. Let's say I know this one company has 1,000+ different APIs. So again, this is a company that has, tens of thousands of developers. They've been developing APIs for probably the past, 5 to 10 years. Don't know exactly, but they have a very complicated product, multiple products, and they build these microservices that sometimes were maybe used at the beginning, sometimes they were sunsetted. But the problem is none of these folks even know which of those APIs or endpoints is actually used. They don't have proper observability tooling to kind of help them understand, hey, this is a dead endpoint, this is a dead API. And everybody, I remember talking to them. My question was, how did you allow this to happen? Generally, just imagine if you employ like 10,000 people, and let's say over the course of 5 years, somebody changes jobs or gets fired, that person might have developed like 5, 6, 7 different APIs. They leave. There's literally almost no documentation about, is this being used? What is it being used for? How is it being used, etc., etc. So you end up in a scenario where everybody is afraid to basically kill off that API because they don't know whether or not that API is being used. So I would say, go ahead.
I was going to say similarly, right? Like where you have a massive company, and I know one in particular, which is one of my favorite companies, where they literally just say we're cutting this percentage of employees across the company, and that whole team exits the company, and nobody's there to pick up the work that they were doing.
Not just that. No, go ahead.
There's a few different themes, I think, in this conversation that I want to highlight. So there is, of course, the design angle of like designing APIs with a certain set of design guidelines. I think there's the aspect of governance, because in most organizations, API governance is not at a point of maturity where people have the tools needed for observability or oversight into actual visibility into all the APIs and endpoints that they have. So a lot of times there are zombie APIs that are just APIs somebody built who's no longer there, and it's not being maintained, not meeting security reviews or anything. And then there's zombie endpoints, which I think is a slightly different dimension, because having managed APIs at large organizations like Twilio and PayPal, one of the things that I can tell you is deprecating APIs is one of the hardest things to do. And Andy, as a PM, you would know. And most companies tend to just avoid deprecating anything. It's hard from the perspective of like, even if a single user is using it, we want to keep it around. And most of the time it tends to, it's really the nature of API as a product, because your user is a developer, they are on their own developer cycle. So even if I'm trying to ship a new version of the API and I want to deprecate the old one, I'm dependent on my customer and their development team to actually make that migration, which they may or may not prioritize, they may or may not do in the time I want, and I have to continue supporting them as the API provider. So there's a lot of aspects that go into why we end up with zombie APIs or zombie endpoints, and ends up happening more and more in large organizations. We see that even in the state of the API reports, this concern of zombie APIs was more common among large enterprises. Is because as you become a large enterprise, you just have more developers, you have developer churn, you are dealing with a large customer base, and just operationally it's not possible to work through those challenges to uh, to overcome this zombie API problem. It could be and ultimately it ends up being like Vedran, you said earlier, it's like it's a huge it's definitely a security risk, but actually even more than a security risk, it's also a huge maintenance cost that
I
is
agree.
And
added.
Either way, I think
Deepa,
we all agree that if something is being unused, it's very bad. Generally,
yeah.
you should try to
And,
avoid having any zombie APIs or endpoints.
yeah. Deepa, actually, you made me think of something, and it made me like maybe want to rethink this, right? Like maybe some of these aren't like we're calling them zombie APIs, right? But maybe we need to shift and think about them as legacy APIs versus zombie APIs. I don't know, just something like I just sparked a thought that maybe we need to be a
Interesting.
little bit more nuanced about that. So
Definitely.
Maybe
I mean, there could be, I think there's the aspect of, especially with zombie endpoints, there could be an aspect of use case based dimension where they're around for a use case that's just used uh, less frequently. And there is the aspect of legacy endpoints,
yeah.
which could be something to dive into uh, or in terms of like when we look at these unused endpoints, why they exist. And when we try to dig deeper and answer that question, I'm sure we'll find even more interesting patterns.
I feel like the next report we do next year, we have even more work than this year. So we'll try to answer some of these very interesting questions. Good thing we're recording this, so we can actually go back and listen
go
to all
back
the
and
good
see.
ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I think Vedran, like what I liked about our report is right. Like when we were together, kind of thinking through it, it was like we don't want to like have like we want the data to speak for itself, right? A lot of times you see reports, and I think Postman does a great job of, with their report, right, where you just sort of like show the data and like let people, because each people have different circumstances, each company has a different like focus, and like some data point that we're showing like may make them think of something completely different that may or may not matter to us, right? And I think I like our report because we just like we weren't super opinionated or like didn't dive too much into, oh well, this means X or this means Y, right?
I left all the opinions for occasions like this, and as you know, I do have strong opinions. One of those opinions is that developers simply are not, or engineering is simply not not very informed about all the potential HTTP response codes. As you know, there's like a couple of groups: 100 range, 200 range, 300 range, 400 range, and of course 500 range. In total, there's like 63 different HTTP response codes. Now, I'm really passionate about response codes because I've simply interacted with so many APIs where somebody tried to reinvent the wheel, so to say, when they were building an API and wanted to kind of go beyond and above to try to explain what is wrong. So usually people return a 200, then inside of the actual JSON payload, they say status false, and then like message, here's what the error is, or something like, or even better, they just say error, right? So you have no idea what went wrong. But essentially, the reason why I love HTTP response codes is because each and every single one of them has a specific meaning, right? A meaning that is universally understood across borders, continents, cities, languages, whatever. So if you return a 404, everybody in the world means that it actually implies something that isn't found. So when we looked at the data, we saw, like Deepa mentioned earlier, 93% of all responses belong in the 2xx group, which generally means that when people triggered an API request, that did succeed, or at least they were returning a code in that range, followed along by kind of client side errors, which we talked about, 4%, and then 3xx redirection kind of response codes, and finally 1% is the server response codes, 5xx range. Now we've talked about how this data might be impacted by the fact that a lot of people are using this on production, which probably means that, you know, engineering has polished it off, QA did their job, so we're seeing less errors. But this is still probably a bigger kind of number when you come to people who are supposed to implement this APIs. They're still facing a bunch of problems. If we go even deeper and analyze like 200, you'll see that predominantly 87% of all responses are just 200 okay. We have some others like 204, 201, 206, but generally these are just 200 okay. When we talk about the 400 range, which we've touched upon, most of them, 2.1% of any kind of response code, any API request in the 400 response code is 401 unauthorized.
This is why we don't have auth.
Yeah, exactly. And the second most popular, I would say, is 404 not found. So just briefly, to not kind of talk too much about these things, it kind of goes hand in hand with the data that a lot of people are not using auth, and a lot of people forget to authenticate even when they're kind of integrating these APIs. And I've seen this happen a million times. And I've seen engineers who were like, I'm 100% authorizing. I asked them like 5 times, are you sending a bearer token? Yes, I am. Then we turn on some kind of observability tool like Trouble, and it turns out they're not. They forgot to authorize or something like that. So we've talked about it. You guys are not surprised. Anything?
No, actually, I think 92% success was a little surprising to me, just
Okay.
because these are production APIs. I would have expected that to be higher. So I think, one of the things I would love to dive into is like, if we actually talk to some of these customers whose data you have, if you had some insight into how satisfied they are with their SLAs, and are they able to meet them, like
Mm-hmm.
how are they setting up their SLAs, because these
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to be production APIs, and if this is meeting their expectation, because I suspect it is not. So that would be my
Like I
next.
mentioned, we do have I would say a predominant amount of production APIs, but some of them are both internal APIs where things are quite messy,
Mhm.
and as well as I would say partner APIs where again things are probably not as polished as a really huge public Twilio like or PayPal like API. Um, the next kind of topic that we wanted to dive deep from or at least wanted to cover from a design perspective is about SDKs. Now, the way that kind of trouble works and the way that we can actually detect this is we have these little agents or SDKs for every single language, programming language that there is. And generally, we can then understand, okay, which SDKs are making the most amount of requests, right? So here in this breakdown, we kind of see that, and again, some of this data is probably due to, our popularity in a particular community.
Yeah.
But I would say generally, Laravel or the PHP community is quite a large at Treble, but then followed by JavaScript, which is essentially Node.js, Express, and all of these other languages. Then Microsoft things like .NET Core, .NET, etc., and then followed along with stuff like Strapi, Django, Spring Boot, and others. So one surprising thing to me, we see essentially presence of like three major kind of languages: JavaScript, the PHP world, and .NET. I have to tell you that previously, in previous years, .NET wasn't as high or as popular than it is this year. My only conclusion to this is that kind of Microsoft has invested a lot in developer tooling. I know they've done some really interesting stuff when it comes to .NET Core and building APIs. So I know a lot of developers are really happy with what they've done. Do you guys have any other insights into this, or want to spend some time talking about it?
I don't. I just had the same. I was kind of surprised as you were that Node.js was so high, and then obviously the Microsoft also was so high. Just like given like our community and our at least our vocal community.
Yeah. Deepa, you see anything that kind of resembles what you guys see in
So
Postman?
we don't have a breakdown by languages, at least in our report this year, but I think it would be interesting to compare this to GitHub's report
Mm-hmm.
on most popular languages, and I think it is the same list
Yeah,
uh, of
it's
the three. So I think that's very consistent in
to me
terms of.
the only, like I said, PHP has been around, and people are building. Believe it or not, people are building many great APIs in PHP. We're one of those.
Right.
JavaScript, I think everybody's building. Everybody and their grandma just kind of uses JavaScript nowadays to build anything, especially backend. But .NET, like I said, was kind of something that I didn't expect. I would expect Django or even Java.
Yeah.
But
But .NET I view as much more of like an enterprise.
it is,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
.NET Core, right? Which is kind of, I'm not a .NET guy, so maybe something I say is wrong, but .NET Core seems like a more modern version of .NET. And like I said, I've seen some code behind .NET, and it did look pretty cool. And I know like a lot of people use VS Code, which is Microsoft's. A lot of people use GitHub, which is now Microsoft. Azure. So I think
Yeah.
they've kind of built this kind of ecosystem of basically, hey, if you're building an API, you can easily use our tool to develop it, use our tool to track code changes, use our tool to deploy it, and everything in between.
Yeah, there's always going to be this aspect of like traditionally widely used languages will continue to have a lot of infrastructure already built
Yeah,
on them, uh, because a lot of organizations are not going to be moving away anytime soon, and it's not easy. And in addition to that, considering like Microsoft continues to make significant investments in their developer tools,
yeah,
there's just more support for certain uh, languages than others. And even if sometimes it's not the most fun, oftentimes it's really like an enterprise decision,
yeah,
that developers just have to deal with. Uh, so there's quite a few factors that go into like the prevalence of it.
yeah,
Um, of like what are developers mostly using. I think where we might see a switch is if we were to break down this data specifically for AI. It's possible that we
yeah,
see a little bit uh, more signal of what are the latest preferences of developers, just because most of that AI development has happened in recent times.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there might be just more
and
signal of
probably
current opinion.
if when we talk about AI, I would probably expect Python to be much higher
Yeah.
than something like
So
PHP on the list. Agreed.
totally possible.
Agreed. Moving on, we've got two, I would say, let's call them short and sweet sections. The first one is API performance and then API security. So, on the performance side, we of course wanted to analyze the kind of holy grail of performance, which is kind of load times, if you will. And here we've got my kind of simplified conclusion to this is either APIs are either super fast or super slow. There really is not that big of a middle, I would say. So essentially, 54% of APIs, or 55 if you kind of take it, uh, have a load time of below 150 milliseconds, which is I would say a really great load time. Like even for API insights, we kind of take that into an account as like a really amazing load time. That this data also collides with the fact that a lot of the requests are GET requests, which are usually a lot faster and can be cached, which means you can cache it on a DNS level, on a network level, on a database query level. Either way, you can cache it. So that kind of makes sense. The second biggest category, however, is API requests that are kind of above 500 milliseconds. And we can see that there's like 27% of all requests are kind of, I would say, really, really slow. And then there's 11% of them, let's say, are between 150 to 200 milliseconds. And then 8% are between 300 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds. So, what do you guys make of this?
Did you also slice it by the number of endpoints that some of these have?
We didn't. This report next year is going to be like 100 pages. We didn't because, to me, I expected these results to be actually worse. So, yeah, I didn't expect so many APIs to have such a good load time. But when I started thinking about it and started thinking about like the languages that are used, it actually makes a lot of sense in my opinion. Like you have generally, when you think about it, APIs are built by technologies and teams and individuals that have been around for a very long time. So, for example, something like .NET or PHP world, these languages have existed and we've built APIs for like 15, 20, 30 years, right? And then you have something like JavaScript, which came along, let's say, less than 10 years ago, that maybe doesn't have as much experience in building really good optimized APIs. So it kind of made sense that there's people who are really good at building APIs, and then there's people who are really bad at building APIs.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, there's a lot of other factors that play into this, right? That we don't know. But overall, I agree. I think, you know, some people think it's subjective, right? Like what's fast, what is fast, right? Some people think, you know, less than 1,000 milliseconds is fast or 2,000 milliseconds. So I agree. I think overall, I think speeds are pretty good. And for those that are greater than 500 milliseconds, like I'm curious why. Like, is it where you're hosted? Is it, you know, is it clunky code? Do you need optimizations there? So I think there's a lot of questions that we just, you know, obviously this report doesn't answer. And
one of the things I want to highlight though is like you mentioned, you know, Treble is an observability platform, and any development team, any company using a platform like Treble, I would say is, you know, irrespective of if it's like a public or commercial or internal APIs, they are already at a point in their maturity in terms of how they approach their APIs that they care about something like load times. So it's good to see that being true in the data, that considering like most APIs are in the positive range, is you're already seeing people who care enough to think about the observability problem. So they care about their APIs, they're interested in diving into the different aspects of performance and security and design, and so they are actively thinking about their APIs. One of the things is like one of the first key findings in Postman's report was actually like 92% of the respondents said that their investment in APIs was either going to grow or remain the same. So it's true that the industry is investing heavily in APIs, so it's inevitable that a lot of people are thinking about observability, especially organizations that are mature and are maybe facing problems or starting to reach that point where they're trying to address some of these things. So it's expected that you have a certain maturity of customers who
and I think from
very well put,
from a product perspective, like, so Treble could be like really opinionated, right? Where you could say like your API is crap because it load time so slow, right? But I think like part of our job as product managers is to say, here's like the typical range, right? Like here's the benchmark that you should aim for and maybe give some tips on how to improve. Just like Postman, I think would be well served to say, you're developing an API, you're using this language, like here's some code optimizations that you should probably do to have a performant API, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
That kind of, Andy kind of said it. I'm a strong proponent of any API responding in less than 150 milliseconds, and I'll kind of never back down from that. There are probably reasons why, if you're doing a massive database query, but still you can optimize a lot of that. And like Deepa said, I think we are starting to see, I would call it a Google Lighthouse moment for APIs. I remember like when back in my previous life as like a consultant and somebody who built websites and APIs for other clients, I always cared about performance. Even when we were doing like websites, like it was always the minimum amount of JavaScript, the minimum amount of CSS, minimum amount of images. And then at one point, like people started realizing, holy shit, our website is super slow. We need to invest in actually making that faster. At first people started hiring outside consultants. I've been tasked multiple times to kind of go in and optimize a website. The reason why we were able to kind of do that or even prove to a client that that's worth it is because Google Lighthouse came out and Google said, hey, your performance is going to impact your SEO score, which essentially translates to the number of searches we lead to your website, because if it's slow, we'll kind of downgrade you. Everybody got kind of scared and said, hey, we need to fix this, otherwise our search traffic goes down. I think APIs are starting to become, becoming more in the spotlight and becoming more central to what people are doing. And that's why you'll see a lot of kind of investment, like Deepa said, into quality and a lot of this stuff. So moving off from just quickly on this one, combined with the response codes, which we kind of saw both between 4xx range and 5xx range was around 5%, give or take. We wanted to take a look. One of the things that we essentially do, because we're an SDK, we can actually latch onto code exception tracking on a code level. So when a developer leaves buggy code, we can actually capture that regardless of whether or not they return a 400, 500, whatever it is they do, we can actually capture that. So this kind of tells you that the previous kind of data aligns with this, is we've been able to capture 4% of exceptions across code bases. This means that 4% of the time, developers really leave something messed up in the code that actually crashes the API to one or the other degree. Like either they don't respond properly or they actually crash the entire server. Again, something that, in my opinion, kind of matches the data we've seen with the number, with the response codes and everything else. Any kind of thoughts here, or should we move on to the last kind of category of in API performance?
I think this looks good and it's in line with other findings, so I think we can move on.
Nice. The last one in this category is just, again, something that we wanted to kind of understand, and I feel like next year we're just gonna go into more and more of these breakdowns. But we wanted to see across the programming languages or SDKs, we have this thing called the API score, right? And the API score is essentially something that Treble measures on every single request across 3 different categories: so security, performance, and quality. So we, for example, we measure things like, are you returning a valid JSON? Is your API request secure enough? A bunch of different things. Is it fast enough? And we give an overall score to that request and then to the API itself. So we wanted to understand theoretically who is building the best APIs. And this breakdown kind of shows you that essentially the top score is actually Laravel, which is a framework in PHP. It's also the one that we predominantly use. But besides me being a fan of Laravel, the reason why I think they have a much higher score than a lot of these others is they are very opinionated, right? So in Laravel, it's very hard to build a shitty API because they just kind of won't allow you to go outside of that mold of kind of messing up so much that you lose on security or lose on performance. Yes, you can do that, but it's very minimal. The next, which was somewhat surprising and somewhat not, we come back to that question of who has the most experience in building APIs. .NET has .NET Core has the second biggest score, and .NET the third biggest score. If we take a look at, for example, the JavaScript world of Node.js and Express and some of these other kind of JavaScript frameworks, they have a pretty bad kind of score. And that, to a degree, I really don't mean to bash on any language or any kind of framework, but it's just probably a matter of experience, right? A lot of folks kind of come into the JavaScript world maybe from a front end perspective and start building APIs or something like that, and then maybe they're not on par with quality. So it was a fun kind of exercise to run through. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts or any insights on this.
I think this might vary, or this might not vary, but like this might shed light on the size of the organization. It might have,
Yeah.
it might be correlated with the size of the organization, the age of the organization that's producing these APIs. It's because, like I said earlier, it's like a lot of times this is an organizational decision.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, like, one of the things that I would feel is like .NET, I would imagine, is mostly large mature organizations are probably using it, and
And
not
probably
just
have QA teams and
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Yep.
So there might be other factors that lead to better results,
Mm,
um, that enable them to ship a
yeah.
higher API score
Yeah.
uh, versus others. So
Yeah.
there might be that dimension that has a
Probably.
correlation.
Probably. The next section, we only have security, and the last section is market. We'll kind of try to be fast and finish in the next 10 minutes. But security, we've talked about one huge thing. I don't want to kind of go over it, but just to recap, almost 51% of all APIs are unauthenticated. 49% are authenticated. We had a discussion about it. I feel like this should be at zero at a minimum, maybe 1% unauthenticated. It's just one of those. It's like hygiene, right? You're washing your hands every single day and kind of keeping the bacteria and viruses out of your system. I feel like that's how we should think about authentication on APIs. But the next big kind of thing that I always come back to and wanted to analyze is HTTPS versus HTTP usage. And I'm really happy that this year more developers are using HTTPS. Now, 74% of all kind of requests were sent over like a secure HTTP version or HTTPS, and 26% are only were served using HTTP. Now, again, to Deepa's point before she makes it, probably a lot of maturity levels, a lot of different organizations. But generally, as somebody who lived in an age not that long ago where if you wanted to use HTTPS or have an SSL certificate on your website, you had to pay like $2,500 for it per year. Now, every single DNS provider essentially is offering HTTPS for free. I really
Interesting.
don't see why this wouldn't be 0 or 1%, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so many benefits of HTTPS, like you're essentially reducing your kind of exposure to the world. The data is encrypted over HTTPS, etc.,
Yeah.
etc.
I think
So
this makes sense, especially from the perspective of like over the years, we have seen consistent investment
yeah,
in the APIs that people are building, and also uh, security has been a top of mind concern. So it makes sense that over time we would see a pattern of change in decision making,
yeah,
and we would see the switch. So I agree with you. Like, we would like to ideally see even more of a skew towards HTTPS
Yeah.
over time. So we'll see next year if the trend is uh,
exactly.
changing further.
It did improve. I had like, we didn't publish this, but I think last year we did a small version of our this report, and it was a lower number for HTTPS. So it has been going up, and hopefully it will go up. The next one is a security, something we call security threat level. So again, going back to what we do at Treble, we wanted to kind of simplify security for people who are not security experts, like basically all of us on this call, right? So for me, when I would go in and talk to these security guys, it was always like these really complicated graphs, these really overcomplicated structures of why something is or isn't secure. So we wanted to simplify that, and we kind of, on every single request, we measure 16 different signals, and literally based on that, group requests into either low threat level scores, low threat levels, medium threat levels, and high threat levels. For example, high threat levels, somebody's doing an SQL injection on you, you're not using authorization or HTTPS, and somebody's doing an SQL injection. That would be a really high threat level. Medium, you're probably either not using something like auth plus HTTPS, and have some other security design issues. And low, you're basically as clear as it gets. You should maybe work on some like design choices. So 55% of all requests fall into the medium category, 44 into the low category, and 1% in high category. The 1% is probably people who are getting hacked. So this means 1% of a billion requests, somebody at a minimum was doing an SQL injection on those requests, or the IP reputation of the person who's making the request is very, very questionable. So I would say these are really problematic requests or actors. Everything else, I would love to see next year maybe more low. Basically, what medium means, just for both of you, like we measure a lot of different design choices. For example, are you using UIDs over IDs? Are you allowing your API to be embedded using an iframe or something like that? So these are the things that we look at when giving out these scores, and that's why medium predominantly means people are still not aware how many things they can slightly tweak to improve their API score. And one consistently kind of underrated thing that I've seen that causes a lot of problems are actually headers. So we even mentioned that right here. Like there are a lot of security headers, or generally HTTP headers, that tell a lot of information about your API or generally your server, which you should kind of tweak. We do have a series of articles on our blog which can help you with that. But generally, before we dive into the market, does anybody want to say anything about security in general, or anything?
I mean, it's important, right? And
And
everybody, I
also,
think
none of us
everybody,
know anything about security.
yeah. But I think the API security market is pretty saturated, right?
Yeah.
And yet, I think we still see this sort of lack of adoption of good security tooling, or at least good security implementation And for me, that's just a little bit troubling that you have all these options. And again, I think it comes down to a cost, like a cost risk benefit analysis, right? And where it's just like, it's just too costly to get good security tooling for, the potential risk. And what happens is companies don't invest in that, and then they get screwed when they do have a breach, and it costs them way more than what it would have cost them to implement a tool, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think there's also the aspect of governance and maturity here, because I think only like we're seeing this rapid growth in the API space. People have been so overwhelmed with just trying to ship their APIs that I think now we're seeing this rise of organizations. They've reached a point where they're starting to think more deeply about some of the problems, and that's where they start to think about security. It's like, okay, we have so many APIs, and this is a huge risk, or this is a security concern. And I think that's what leads to sort of them only now starting to consider security tooling, and looking at some of these findings, that and realizing that it's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
So,
and
I
there's
think
more than just APIs, right? Like if you're a security team or security organization, you're looking at a lot of things from a security perspective, and APIs are only, a portion of that, right? So a lot of it's resources as well.
I feel like I don't wanna bash on the vendors and tooling providers, but when it comes to security, even I can speak from personal experience. Like I'm aware that we should do even more security wise, but I feel like all of these security products are purposefully so complicated that if you're a product person, or even somebody who's, let's say, remotely interested in security but not an expert, it's really hard to kind of find your way around that. And that's why we want to kind of make it super simple. In another aspect of security, especially in the context of APIs, is it's really hard. I'm sure both of you as product managers, I mean, I know you, Andy, and Deepa as well, care about security. It's very complicated to see and feel the security if you don't see the API requests. I feel like a lot of this is just like the fact that most people don't get to see the requests and what data is being sent, how is the API behaving, where is the user coming from, etc., etc. Like, I don't want to name any countries, but for example, most of our APIs are, let's say, most of the traffic comes from like 15 countries, right? If I see a country, again, I don't want to name any countries, I immediately become suspicious about like what's going on, especially if I see a consecutive amount of requests. But the reason why I can do that is I actually see the country in trouble, right? Before trouble, using something like, I don't know, some kind of other monitoring tool, I wouldn't actually be able to see that. I would see an IP address, which wouldn't tell me a lot of information. So I think tooling wise, everybody has to do much better, and so on and so forth. The last category, we'll try to get through this in like less than 5 to 10 minutes, but it's also fascinating, is the API market. So here, we wanted to understand who are the people that are building these APIs. So as you know, AI APIs doubled this year, but predominantly when we looked at the data, and again, the categorization of this data, might be a bit weird, but we're also kind of doing our best to try to fine grain all of these. Most of the APIs are either IT and services in that area. A lot of it is other, which means we don't know exactly what it is. But surprising, higher education and financial services are the second two biggest. Which again, I don't think that would be that much surprising, for at least for finance. I think the maturity of financial institutions when it comes to APIs is probably the highest amongst all other categories. And then I feel like higher education is just going through this digital transformation where everybody is now building APIs, especially during COVID, when a lot of kind of colleges, a lot of kind of research labs and everything transitioned to something like remote, and had to essentially build technology stacks and everything else. How do you guys read into this, Deepa? What do you think about this? This kind of anything that this speak? What speaks to you here?
So I agree with you in terms of like banking or financial services would generally have like higher like that is expected, higher usage, higher number of APIs, more higher standards. It's also in line with what we see, with what we saw consistently over the years in the state of the API report at Postman. Financial banking services have always remained the front runners. And alongside, especially in API space, we would always see technology players uh, also sort of being the top. So I think those two. So I think it's very much in line with what the state of the API report showed at Postman. So it's not surprising, I guess, the distribution here.
Yeah,
I think what I would be interested in is really which industries are growing at the fastest pace
yeah.
at this point, like considering that, okay, like banking and technology have been front runners, but are we seeing other industries actually rise up the ranks?
That's something that I think we can start tracking for next year.
Mhm.
Believe it or not, in order for us to get meaningful data, we actually have to implement the tracking of it probably in January. So we'll try to actually do that and then have a consistent stream of at least 11 months of data, or at least
Yeah.
like.
And I don't know how you like get people to like the category other.
So,
How
yeah,
do you get
yeah.
people to self like identify, right?
So I think we're gonna have to do a good job on V3, Andy, and that'll help us. But that's a March or April thing. But generally, the way that we collected this data is actually when people create an account on Trouble, we actually kind of ask them, "Hey, what organization do you work in?" Then we kind of try to find some information on the internet about that organization and what category that they would fall in, and that's how we base.
We just won't. We just will remove other. We'll just
Yeah,
remove.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Bruno immediately when I asked Bruno Pedro, "Hey, do you want to kind of? Can you give me an opinion about the report?" And one of the first thing he's like, "What is other? Tell me what is inside." So, so we'll try to figure out. We'll try to understand what is other. But again, I think the first one probably a lot of startups, a lot of kind of companies that kind of usually produce APIs are the ones that are kind of predominantly using and building APIs. We've talked about AI. I think just to briefly recap and kind of summarize, I think everything that's happening in AI, you can literally say that is happening in API. I feel like AI is the best thing that could have happened in to APIs, and I don't know if you disagree or not.
I definitely agree. I think considering one of the things I found really interesting was just like now there is more people who have observed how the Chat GPT came out last year in
Yeah,
November, and then people have firsthand experience, like people at large have experienced that when OpenAPI exposed their APIs, then suddenly you saw this growth of products built on top. And I think
yeah,
that journey that now everybody has gone through together is all you need to understand in terms of like the impact of APIs
yeah,
Yeah.
is they expose their APIs, and now you have hundreds of products and
yeah.
experiences built from it, and that's what APIs do for you and
Exactly,
make possible.
exactly. That
I
you summed it up perfectly. Andy, you wanted to
yeah.
say?
No, yes, I totally agree. AI has been good for APIs. It will continue to be good for APIs. I have other thoughts on AI But that's for another conversation.
Nice. Hopefully they're positive, but generally, I feel like going forwards, if this continues, especially the more AI stuff happens, the better for the API economy in general, and I think people will start to realize the full potential of APIs, and I think the next thing that's going to happen that might be huge for APIs is when kind of Apple releases their kind of AR, VR, whatever they are, glasses, because I feel like a lot of a lot of interactions there is also going to be API based. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that kind of plays out in the context of APIs. Now, the next one, just briefly again, we wanted to analyze the API score, which we kind of introduced with the SDKs across the industries. So just briefly, again, the biggest API score, or people who are producing the most quality APIs, work in management consulting, right? And that's I would say a 69. And then you've got folks from online media, internet, and higher education. Again, I feel like that kind of makes sense, because if you're hiring consultants to build you an API, so I don't know, I don't want to name any consulting company specifically, but if you're hiring them, you're paying really big bucks, and you're probably expecting really big numbers.
And it looks like the money is worth it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, good observation.
Yeah, definitely. Or at least they're hiring good engineers, that's for sure. But essentially, that kind of seems to be the point. Online media, I also struggle to kind of understand who fits into this category as well fully. But my assumption is essentially probably a lot of news portals, a lot of kind of content networks that are probably advertising based. Now, the reason why these APIs are probably really fast is because of SEO. So I'm assuming that a lot of these companies are using an API first approach, where they're building an API and powering their entire website based out of it, mobile apps, everything in between. So if they want to rank really high and get people to stay on their website, they really need to produce great APIs. I would say internet in general fits there as well. So
in contrast, governments don't want you to go to their websites.
Exactly. I think that also speaks for itself. That has probably been I don't know. I feel like if one metric in this report is absolutely true, then it's definitely this one. I know it personally. Like when it comes to governance, they except, again, I don't want to play favorites, but for example, the UK government has been doing a lot of stuff for APIs, and I know a lot of kind of folks from UK government regularly. I see them at API days and all of these conferences. So some are investing really a lot, some not that much. But I think this is a resource constraint, if not something else.
Maybe.
The last kind of three things that I wanted to cover is just quickly locations. So Deepa, you kind of asked at the beginning.
At the very beginning, yeah.
Yeah, what's the breakdown between United States and the rest of the world, if you will. I would say 58% of all requests originated from United States. If you take almost 9% of Canada, that's basically well above 67%, or predominantly from this part of the world. You do see a lot, for example, to my surprising, Ireland was quite high on the list. I expected to see some other countries. For example, I originally thought I would see Italy here, but in Europe, the most popular country makes sense, Germany. I wanted to say United Kingdom, but theoretically, they're no longer in Europe, so I won't. Russia, we still see a lot of activity. 7%, originate from Russia, and of course, I actually thought that India would have a bigger role here. But again, this might be to our kind of to our end consumers and who their end consumers are, right? So
Yeah.
if we have a company from US and predominantly most of their users are from the US, you're gonna see that reflected here. But I would say a much more interesting stat to me is where the city breakdown. And I kind of have this really kind of, I said that essentially the capital of APIs is Ashburn, Virginia, in the United States. And the explanation behind that is actually pretty simple. It's probably the most original location of AVS data centers.
Yeah,
So
AWS. Yeah.
properly, this is the US East Coast data center for AVS. Like I said, I think it's the original one where
Oh.
you see a lot of servers are hosted, a lot of
Yeah.
kind of.
But that this all matches up, right? There's an AWS data center in Frankfurt, in Dublin, Ashburn.
Yeah.
So that all sort of like aligns with that.
Yeah. Then the last two that we can look at is essentially one of the things that I care kind of, I would say, deeply about is who is actually making these requests to these APIs. And so far, we only have three categories. With our next version, we're gonna be able to give you an even fine-grained breakdown. So we'll be able to tell you like in desktop, is it Mac, is it Windows, is it this browser, is it that browser. But for now, we know that almost 55% belongs to desktop based computers, right? Macs, Windows, whatever it is. 22.4% to iOS and 22.7% to Android. Again, I thought iOS would be much higher, but then there are more Android devices in the world and probably more apps for Android. Not sure if that number is correct, but
I would have expected desktop to be a smaller share, just considering in most parts I see, especially looking at like just commercial APIs.
yeah,
We generally see uh, desktop being a smaller share, and sort of mobile and tablet being increasingly higher share in distribution. So this is an interesting
there
phenomena.
I think I might have an explanation for it. There are a lot of APIs who do calls to other APIs,
Mhm.
so I think a lot of the desktop stuff comes from one API calling another API, which kind of
Mhm.
matches the microservice theory or architecture that we've kind of mentioned at the
Yeah.
beginning. If you have an API that calls other APIs, the originating requester or consumer of that second API is the first API. So, in a
Right.
microservice world, this somewhat makes sense. That's
Mhm.
my only kind of explanation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very plausible theory. I
We'll
can
see.
buy that.
We'll see if we can prove that theory next year. The next and last thing is, of course, request volume per day of week. We've talked about it. Wednesday being the most popular day, and essentially probably Q4 of this year and Q3 currently is the most popular
Yeah.
one. That kind of leaves us to kind of a conclusion, which I'd love for you to kind of let voice your thoughts about where we are and where you think we're going in 2024, and then we can kind of wrap it up.
So I can go first. I think thanks for putting together this great report. I think it's very insightful to see uh, this kind of production APIs and their patterns, and uh, how what we can learn from it. I think some of the things that really stand out to me are the fact that there is an emphasis on security, which continues to be a top concern for people in developing APIs, people consuming APIs, and it looks like there is continuous investment in that space. So I think over the years we would continue to see improvements in that area as the investment continues. I think one of the other things I find really fascinating is the I really enjoyed the discussion around zombie APIs and endpoints. I think that was really fun and insightful. I think a lot of it actually uh, hints on a lot of conversations that people are having around API governance, API maturity, security. So it really brings together a lot of top of mind topics for API practitioners when we look at some of these data points. Uh, and there's so many things that sparked my curiosity as I read through this report. And as we discussed, I'm really excited about what the next year's report is going to be like, and all the insights we'll get from it. So thank you.
Thank you for kind of joining and voicing your opinions. I really appreciate it. Andy, from your side.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think all these reports are really good, right? Like these sort of like things that get us to think more deeply about APIs. One, because API just keep growing, right? The number of APIs just keep growing. I will say, I think AI, because it's sort of leading to maybe like a mini explosion of APIs, is coming at a good time, right? Where we, as sort of an industry, as sort of a thought, as sort of a group of people who have thought about this, and I'm not included in that. I think there's some other people who have contributed a great deal of that, particularly in the last few years, right? But I think this sort of mini explosion of APIs, sort of fostered by AI, is coming at a good time because we do sort of have these things to look at, and we are at a point where we can at least talk a little bit more maturely about what we need to do to make performant APIs, to make secure APIs. We might not be doing it completely right now, but these things help us sort of get on the track to doing that. And obviously, tools like Postman, tools like Treble, are certainly going to kind of work together to help you get there. So yeah.
I agree with what all of you said. Generally, I kind of had the opportunity to speak to a lot of API practitioners over the course of the past year, and I was just sometimes even surprised to see where APIs have penetrated when it comes to technology. So, for example, CERN uses APIs to basically create God particles, right? F1 cars are being tested using APIs. So these are all like very wild scenarios, which I never thought that APIs would kind of be present at, but it actually makes sense, right? The classical examples of moving money, the entire finance world, the entire kind of commodity world runs on top of APIs. Now AI, I feel like next year is going to be a pretty important year for APIs, not just in terms of growth, not just in volume, but I think people are starting actually to realize that APIs matter, and understanding them from every single angle and actually understanding what's going on your API isn't something that somebody in the organization should care about, but fundamentally the entire organization should start understanding that much better. So I don't know if any of our kind of readers or kind of listeners have any questions, but if that's all, we can wrap up this live stream. I want to thank Deepa for joining us, for sharing the insights, Andy as well. And I feel like maybe next year we should do a mashup of the report. Like we'll share our data beforehand with you guys, and then we'll come up with something interesting. So I just want to thank everybody for kind of tuning in and kind of being a part of this. I do need Andy and Deepa to stay after the stream ends so we can actually finish uploading this. But the rest of you, I really appreciate it, and wish you all the best for the upcoming holidays.
For sure. Happy holidays.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for attending.
Bye.